Whenever a journalist like myself decides to change the topic of a conversation and speak to UFO aficionados about the moon as opposed to all of the spaceflight enthusiasts who watch my channel about the moon, the nature of the conversation usually changes radically. Since the time of the Apollo astronauts, the moon has been a hotspot for UFO activity. Indeed, most UFO aficionados argue that the moon is being used as a base by extraterrestrial civilizations, or that the moon might be hollow and artificial itself. Given how many vast lava tubes exist in the craters of the moon and other locations that might be accessible to the surface, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that these craft may indeed be using these sheltered locations as a base of operations for frequent visits to our planet. And given the fact that we haven't been back there, at least not with human-rated missions, for over half a century, that may indeed be the case. However, there are other things to consider. Even though we haven't actually visited the moon in person for quite some time, the moon is under continuous observation by telescopes, by unmanned landers and orbiters, and even by orbiters whose specific job is to photograph and film the surface of the moon on a regular basis, such as the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, or LRO. And all of that being the case, how often has NASA actually seen things that look anomalous or artificial in the moon's craters, given how many times outside observers seem to spot these things? And if NASA has indeed seen these things many times in the past, are they covering everything up? Is it possible that NASA has known about UFOs on the moon for over half a century, and only now are we starting to learn the truth? All of this and more coming at you on The Angry Astronaut right now. Of all the so-called alien ruins and alien spacecraft on the moon photographs that I've seen in my time, this, in my opinion, is one of the more intriguing photos. Not necessarily because it looks any more genuine than any of the other ones, but because of the cylindrical nature of this object and the fact that it actually could bear a great deal of resemblance to Oumuamua. Now, creative digital artists like Sparmy1 on YouTube, and by the way, I really recommend that you visit his YouTube channel because it's quite intriguing, the digital image that he's created, or digital modeling rather, of whatever this object is on the moon. But whatever this is, it gave rise to one of the most amazing and unbelievable UFO stories in history, the so-called Apollo 20 mission that was allegedly dispatched in 1976 to explore this object. Now, before I get to any of that, let's go ahead and look at the actual evidence, the things that Apollo astronauts actually said about UFO sightings before they had a chance to go back and clarify themselves, or talk to their handlers at NASA, or consider what talking about UFOs might do to their careers, etc. What have Apollo astronauts actually said? Well, the first unusual experience that Apollo astronauts had when orbiting the moon was experienced by Apollo 10, right before, of course, we actually sat down on the moon, with astronauts Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Gene Cernan hearing what was described as strange sounds or outer space-type music while orbiting on the far side of the moon out of radio. I'm not joking, guys. My microphone gave out at that precise second. That's a little spooky. But in any event, the reason that all of this noise was so unusual and bizarre is on the far side of the moon, there should be no radio interference whatsoever, at least no human-manufactured radio interference. It is for this reason that many astronomers advocate for a radio telescope on the far side of the moon where human interference will never cause a problem, and we will only hear the cosmos with no human-manufactured radio signals mucking it all up, as it does virtually everywhere else. But don't take my word for it. Why don't you go ahead and listen to the actual transcript of what happened during that flight?
Hey, when do we fire the helium tanks?
Not yet, babe.
You want some more brownies?
No.
First, these days a little hungry.
That music even sounds outer spacey, doesn't it? You hear that? That whistling sound?
Yeah.
Woo! Look at your... Yeah, it sounds like, outer space type music. Hey, Tom, is your insulation all burned off here on the front side of your window over here? Right?
Yeah.
Mine's all burned off. Heading out here, weary, John?
But before you get too excited, it's important to note that on that day, the far side of the moon was almost perfectly aligned with the planet Jupiter, a planet that blasts out a lot of radio interference. So it's entirely possible that that is what the astronauts were actually hearing. But there's another possibility based on a recently declassified recording. And after extensive analysis, I can say with total confidence that this is not the planet Jupiter. Okay, I'm sorry, that was irresistible. But in any event, another important factor about these transcripts is the fact that they were kept classified for decades. All of this was only just declassified about 10 years ago, which of course has fueled speculation about their possible extraterrestrial nature. Then we can move on to Apollo 11. Again, these statements have been clarified, retracted, etc., but Buzz Aldrin reportedly described seeing a light out the window that appeared to be moving alongside us. In other words, an orb UAP during the journey to the moon. There was also allegedly an exchange attributed to Aldrin that includes, quote, "What was it?" in reference to two unidentified objects and a long cylinder observed near the lunar surface, with Aldrin allegedly saying, quote, "God, if these damn cameras have picked up anything, what then?" after attempting to photograph the objects. The exchange is cited from coming from an inside NASA source, but was officially repressed. Once again, it's hard to say if that's actually true. Stories also circulated that Neil Armstrong witnessed, quote, two blue, pale, glowing orbs and multiple UFOs on the crater's rim during the lunar landing. But undoubtedly the most compelling UFO advocate amongst the Apollo astronauts was astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who has had quite a bit to say about UFOs and aliens. While he was interviewed at the National Press Club in Washington nearly 2 decades ago, he had this to say, quote, "We are being visited. It is now time to put away this embargo of truth about the alien presence. I call upon our government to open up and become a part of this planetary community that is now trying to take our proper role as a spacefaring civilization." By the way, Mitchell has a PhD in aeronautics and astronautics from MIT, and he says that it's only a matter of time before we need to evacuate Earth and seek a new home. Quote, "The sun will burn out in due course, and we have to be off this planet if our species is to survive. At this point in human history on the planet, we're now starting and should be to reach out beyond our planet and then beyond our solar system to find out what is really going on out there." He also claimed to have been visited by aliens on Earth and also argued that aliens were trying to prevent a nuclear war from happening during the time of the Cold War. Of course, Mr. Mitchell was not regarded with a great deal of respect by his fellow astronauts and the general scientific community after he started talking like this. It's a bit sad to see how many media sources refer to this man, most of the time referring to him as a nut job. And frankly, I think it's very likely that other astronauts are disinclined to speak openly about aliens, UFOs, and other topics, regardless of what they might have actually seen in space, because of what happened to Mitchell. It's just not a great thing for your career to start talking about these sorts of things. Now, granted, perhaps Edgar Mitchell did have psychiatric issues, but once again, aside from his talk about aliens, there didn't seem to be a whole lot else supporting any sort of diagnosis in that regard. Nor, of course, was he diagnosed with any sort of psychiatric issue, so why did he talk that way? Again, perhaps because he was the only one who had the guts to do it and was willing to trash his career speaking about such topics. But let's go ahead and move on. I think it's also worth mentioning the Apollo 17 mission. Apparently, during this flight, again, this is according to secondary sources and not according to the astronauts themselves, they spotted UFOs during their flight to the moon. This is mostly according to Maurice Chatelain, who is described as a former chief of NASA communication systems. However, other sources that I've researched say that he was actually an engineer who worked for a NASA contractor and not directly for the Apollo program. After all these years, it can be very difficult to confirm the validity of any of these people's stories or their actual identities and jobs that they held at NASA. But let's go ahead and continue. Maurice Chatelain claimed that, quote, all Apollo and Gemini flights were followed both at a distance and sometimes quite closely by space vehicles of extraterrestrial origin, and that astronauts reported these to mission control, which then ordered silence. He also suggested that there were code words used like Santa Claus to refer to UFOs. And by the way, on the Apollo 8 mission, Jim Lovell reportedly said, quote, we have been informed that Santa Claus does exist. Now, of course, this could have been a Christmas joke because, after all, it took place on December 21st, 1968. As a matter of fact, I think that that's almost certainly what it was, and it's a little ridiculous to start reading too much into these transmissions. But at this point, at long last, I think it's time to look into what is perhaps the craziest UFO conspiracy theory of all time, the so-called Apollo 20 mission. And even though you can probably tell from the tone of my voice and the way I'm talking about this right now that I don't believe in this story whatsoever, I do think it may be based on something quite compelling. Our story begins with an ordinary-looking panoramic photograph taken by the Apollo 15 mission while orbiting on the far side of the moon. The image, by the way, is AS15-P-9625. You can look it up yourself quite easily. But what is quite fascinating about this image can be found just to the right of the Delport crater, a cylindrical object at the edge of some sort of ridge. And this is an enhanced image of that cylindrical object that was allegedly taken by the Apollo-Soyuz 20 mission and not just some sort of clever enhancement of the original image, although in my opinion that's certainly what this is. But nevertheless, it is most intriguing. Even the original image is very strange and frankly a bit artificial looking. It just doesn't look like a natural object, and in my opinion it looks a lot more like Oumuamua, although bigger than Oumuamua, because this object, if it indeed is really an object, is over 3 kilometers in length. All that being said, though, I have researched LRO imagery until I'm blue in the face and found nothing else aside from this Apollo 15 photograph. All that having been said, though, let's go ahead and check out this conspiracy theory. Apollo 20 was commissioned by President Nixon specifically because of this Apollo 15 photograph and others that were not released to the public that showed much more clearly what appeared to be alien ruins and an alien spacecraft on the lunar surface. Nixon, of course, very interested in acquiring alien technology, arranged for Apollo missions to be resurrected, and even collaborated with the Soviet Union, because obviously the Soviets would know if we were going back to the moon, so we needed their assistance in order to keep this whole thing covered up, and made this into a collaborative effort to go to the moon and find alien ruins. Again, a fascinating tale told by a William Rutledge, who claimed to have been one of the astronauts on the flight. In addition, on the flight also was astronaut Leona Snyder. Yes, apparently we started including women on Apollo crews far before the time of Sally Ride, and Alexei Leonov, the first man to ever conduct a spacewalk. Their mission was to explore this alien spaceship that was apparently detected by the Apollo 15 crew. It can at least be confirmed that Alexei Leonov was a real astronaut, and, as I said before, the first person to walk in space. The other two, well, perhaps not so much. In any event, the Soviet side was supposedly Soyuz 19. Now, one of the things that really stand out in this story, as far as I'm concerned, is the notion that Alexei Leonov somehow was able to train for a moon mission that allegedly took place just a little over a year after the Apollo-Soyuz mission of 1975. However, it is at least worth mentioning that Saturn V rockets were flying at about this time, not necessarily to send astronauts back to the moon, but for things like Apollo-Soyuz and the Skylab missions. But all of that having been said, if you believe William Rutledge's story, the astronauts visited both an ancient city on the moon's surface as well as an alien spaceship. And by the way, the YouTube videos that were released in conjunction with this story 15 years ago or so are quite intriguing to watch. Again, almost definitely faked, but nevertheless, really interesting stuff to look at if you're interested in science fiction, because once again, I'm going to explain to you why none of this can actually be true. But once again, let's continue with the story. They were able to collect some alien technology in the ship and brought back 2 dead alien pilots back to the lunar module. However, an analysis of meteor impact density on the city and the ship apparently revealed that both of these things, the city and the ship that is, must have been there for at least 1.5 billion years. And it also seemed that the ship had been explored before by perhaps another alien race. William Rutledge, as I said before, posted videos and images on YouTube under the name Retired AFB and other websites. The story even got a little bit of media coverage, although frankly, I missed all of that. I didn't know about it until I started researching moon UFO stories. Even if there are considerable flaws in the video that allow people to identify the story as a hoax, one has to at least admit that they are well done and look quite amazing, and that Rutledge, or whoever released this, spent some time in creating the mock-ups of the Apollo capsules. Now, all that having been said, let me go ahead and explain to those of you who are really getting excited about this right now as to why it could not possibly have happened. First of all, Apollo 17 was the last official Apollo mission. What happened to Apollo 18 and 19 before we even got to Apollo 20? Assuming you believe that this thing actually happened, you also have to believe that NASA covered up an Apollo 18 and 19 mission as well, meaning that 3 Saturn V rockets took off from Earth without anybody noticing. And that is simply impossible, even if the Soviets were collaborating. And one thing that's part of this story is that Apollo 20 lifted off from Vandenberg Air Force Base and not from Cape Canaveral as all the other Apollo missions did, and that's how they were able to keep it a secret. Well, first of all, a Saturn V launch taking place that close to Los Angeles would have been seen. There's no way that could have been covered up. Also, Vandenberg never had the necessary infrastructure to launch Saturn V's. You need massive mobile towers and a massive vehicle assembly facility, for that matter, to put together a Saturn V, and only Cape Canaveral has the capability, even today, to deploy those kinds of rockets and launch them, with the exception, of course, of Elon Musk's Starbase facility that launches Starship rockets. And by the way, every time one of those things takes off, everybody knows about it for miles around, if not further. There's no way that you can launch a rocket as enormous as a Saturn V without being seen. And again, even if the Soviets were collaborating, that wouldn't have changed anything. And that's just the first part of this story that's problematic. Also, a lot of the footage and all of this shaky camera work, it really stands apart from the far smoother camera work that took place on missions like Apollo 11. And I can only imagine that NASA would want much more stable and detailed images of an alien spacecraft. And also, it is a bit convenient to note that these films include quite a lot of footage of the exterior of the ship as they're flying over it, a lot of footage of the alien corpses that they allegedly took out of the ship or the city or whatever, and yet no footage whatsoever of the interior of the spacecraft, walking through the city, any of the stunningly impressive things that these astronauts supposedly saw. No footage of that whatsoever. Why? Well, because the special effects would have been a lot more difficult to fake. All that having been said, though, the object is definitely there and on the far side of the moon, so it's very difficult to get any additional images of this location unless the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter were to be helpful with all of that. And thus far, as I said, I have been unable to find any LRO photos of this specific region to confirm whether or not this object was actually there or it was just a trick of light and shadow. And also, this isn't the only photo from Apollo missions that apparently seems to show UFOs. For example, this photo, sharp-eyed observers have noticed something in the sky, something that definitely shouldn't be there, because all of the imagery that was taken from the surface of the moon was so bright because it took place during the daytime. We're talking about missions that happened in the middle of the lunar day with the reflectivity and high albedo of the lunar surface. You shouldn't be able to see any stars in the sky whatsoever. So what the hell is this? And then, of course, we've got loads of backyard astronomers who are seeing all kinds of interesting objects fly across the image as they watch the moon. And again, this is quite a close-up from a pretty powerful telescope to get this kind of imagery, and you can see all of the atmospheric disturbance here. It's definitely legitimate footage, and here's some really intriguing stuff. This particular sequence was shot while a technician was cleaning the telescope at a local observatory and happened to spot an orb-like object moving across the lunar surface, and it changes trajectory. This thing doesn't just zoom across the face of the moon like a satellite or a bird or an aircraft or something. It changes direction and moves to a different part of the lunar surface. Very intriguing footage here, and you can find this sort of stuff everywhere. Although apparently one of the more popular ways to spot UFOs on the moon is to zoom in on one particular crater on the lunar surface that happens to be lit, by the way, at the exact moment when a UFO emerges from another crater or from a lava tube, something along those lines. This is unquestionably CGI BS, but nevertheless, very, very fun stuff to watch. But no way did someone just happen to zoom in on that part of the moon exactly when this thing decided to emerge from a crater. But this footage, a lot more compelling in my view. Once again, a random event, not an event taking place by design, and an event involving something that changes trajectory as it moves across the face of the moon. I'm not necessarily saying that this is a UFO moving in close proximity to the moon. It might be something moving in the upper atmosphere, and the only reason we can see it is because it's illuminated against the face of the moon. But nevertheless, this is some of the most intriguing footage that I have ever seen involving lunar UFOs. So what's the bottom line? What's the verdict on all of this? Well, the verdict is, in my opinion, it's very possible that extraterrestrial intelligences might be making use of the moon as a base of operations to dispatch exploration missions, expeditions, that sort of thing, to study our civilization without being observed, especially if these bases are located on the far side of the moon where very few things can see them as they are in operation. Is it possible that NASA is covering all of this stuff up? Well, maybe, but I think it's more likely that they have the dominant scientific paradigm going on right now, telling them that all of this stuff is nonsense, that we are not really making contact with extraterrestrial civilizations, and that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And without that extraordinary evidence, they shouldn't be revealing all of this controversial footage to the public. What do you think? I'd like to see your comments. Please feel free to make one, and also don't forget to like and subscribe, and also keep in mind that we are celebrating our 200,000th subscriber with some new merchandise that includes some alien-related merchandise that has the 200K YouTube symbol on it as part of some exclusive merchandise associated with this celebration that will be going out of our merchandise store in 3 weeks. So make sure to take advantage of that if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, stay angry about space.